I am going to talk at the end about the relationship between family firms in Italy and China, but I'm going to actually start out with quite a bit of the paper being about Italian family firms, because that's where I have put the bulk of my ethnographic research. I think the paper was originally entitled something else like Family Firms, Decision Making, and whatever, Global Network. So I apologize that I changed the title because I realized that what I really wanted to talk about here, which is the anthropologist's chance to actually say something to economists, is to make an argument that I have made elsewhere, that we need to consider certain forms of what are considered to be business enterprises as something other than just economic enterprises, and in this case, as a kinship enterprise. So let me just start with a little bit of information about family firms, because I think there's still a lot of misinformation out there about family firms, and people usually when I tell people that I've studied family firms in Italy, I get questions that make it clear that people think that I was in some little house, knitting something, or engaged in some kind of very small-scale craft enterprise. And that's not the case. I was studying industrial manufacturing in the textile industry of Como, Italy. But that kind of image of a family firm, I think, is still prevalent. And so people think of family firms as something that has been eclipsed in an era of industrial manufacturing. And the truth is, of course, that they have not. Family firms have been prevalent throughout the world in both those areas that are characterized as having developed very developed capitalist economies, and those that are seen as just entering now into the capitalist world. There is incredibly strong evidence out there that family firms are enduring, resilient forms that are not just an archaic, transient form that's going to be supplanted by non-family enterprises. So at the end of the 20th century, for example, family firms comprised the vast majority of firms in Western Europe, 75% of all firms in Italy, 80% in Germany, 76% in the United Kingdom. And they're not just limited to small and medium-sized businesses, but they're also present among large businesses. At the beginning of the 21st century, almost half of the top 100 corporations in Italy were family-controlled, as were 1/3 of the top 100 Swiss corporations. And even in the United States, where family firms are the least prevalent, we obviously have some great examples. To cite a few that are in the news these days, just consider the Trump Corporation, the Walton Corporation, Family Corporation, the Koch Family Corporation. And that doesn't even begin to touch all the other very large family enterprises throughout the world, including where I'll end up in my talk today, which is, and to quote a popular movie now, there's also those crazy rich Asian family firms. So let me insert a caveat here, however, one that has had hampered the comparative analysis of family firms both throughout the globe and throughout history, and that is that there is no standard definition of a family firm among scholars and researchers. There's very messy stuff out there where some people use it to refer to a particular form of legal incorporation, where you have to have, let's say 50% or more of the ownership of the firm in the family. Others use it in a wide variety of other ways. So it's a very loose term, and I'm not going to attempt to try to define it here. It's no more of a well-defined term than the household is. Now, attempts by economic sociologists and economic historians to explain the persistence of family firms in particular societies or particular sectors of the business world generally assume that the family firm is a historical anomaly destined to be supplanted by a more efficient and rational managerial capitalism. So this has shaped the way in which researchers have focused their investigations on the efficiencies and inefficiencies that the familiar character of these firms pose for economic actors, including the risks and uncertainties of financial loss. A common assumption in these studies is that the presence of family firms is the result of a political and economic environment lacking in the institutional characteristics of modern capitalist society, in particular, a legal system that secures and enforces property rights, political and economic stability, and the free circulation of information. Now, in this view, family firms are a mode of coping with the uncertainties of capitalism, including its unstable or cyclical economic conditions, recurrent recessions, and periods of slow growth. Non-kinship-based firms, on the other hand, are viewed as more suitable forms of enterprise in a well-functioning capitalist economy. Yet, as the history of capitalism has shown it to be continually characterized by unstable and cyclical economic conditions and uncertainties, such a functionalist explanation of the existence of family firms is clearly inadequate, because the same could be said of any form of enterprise that is prevalent in the world today, including the joint stock company. Now, in the mid-1980s, in contrast, Italian industrial districts in which family firms predominated were acclaimed by scholars such as Fiore and Sable as ushering in a new period of industrialization that was supposed to succeed Fordist mass production. The economic success in the 1970s of the Third Italy, that is the central and northeast areas of the country, was attributed to the networks of small to medium-sized firms that provided the decentralized structure for the manufacture of products ranging from wine and food to ceramics, machine tools, textiles, and electrical appliances. The flexible specialization and innovation of these firms, it was claimed, enabled them to better weather the economic challenges of the 1970s and the 1980s. Yet the rise of the Third Italy, as it was called, in the mid-1970s was hardly the first time that small and medium-sized firms linked in local production networks had predominated in Italy. Some, such as Como's silk industry, had existed since the late 19th century. Now, Fiore and Sable recognized that family firms were the backbone of these Italian manufacturing districts, but they failed to understand that the dynamism of these industrial networks was the product of the generative power of their kinship structure. Not only were the vast majority of the firms owned and managed by families, but their networks were commonly rooted in kinship, friendship, and local community relations. So what I learned about these family firms through intensive ethnographic and archival research in the industrial district of Como in the 1980s and the 1990s was that their strategies and the timing of capital accumulation, reinvestment, firm expansion, diversification, and their management organization were shaped by ideas, sentiments, and commitments of family and gender. These firms were generally organized according to a patriarchal structure in which the head of the firm, usually the father, made decisions in consultation with adult children, usually sons, but increasingly daughters, who managed divisions of the firm. The goals of these firm owners were linked to ideas about the masculine self and men's desires to retain authority in their families. Fathers' goals of handing the firm on to their adult sons, and to a lesser extent to their adult daughters, were motivated by their desire to provide their sons with the means to remain independent of other men, namely employers, and at the same time to provide themselves, the fathers, with the means of maintaining their authority and centrality in the family. Now, in most of the small firms, but also in the medium-sized ones, the owner and his family and relatives commonly worked alongside other employees, in many cases on the factory floor, as production line workers, technicians, and supervisors. Among these family members could be a wide range of kin, including not only the owner and his children, but also siblings, sibling spouses, uncles and aunts, at what we call affinal kin, in-laws, and their children. Whether they worked on the factory floor or in the office as accountants and sales managers, the work of the owner and his family members alongside non-family employees blurred the distinction between labor and capital. Gender also played into the shifting boundary between owners and workers and their unequal share in the firm's profits. Wives, daughters, sisters, and other female family members commonly worked in the family firm, especially during the early years before the firm became well established. Since their work was treated as an extension of their family duties rather than as productive labor, they received less compensation than male family members, and sometimes none at all. This was especially the case where sons were expected to take over the firm, whereas daughters were expected to marry out with a smaller share of the family patrimony. Often, of course, the work of family members was not officially reported, and needless to say, any work that was put into caring for family members, mediating family conflicts, and helping to raise the next generation of the family was not recognized as productive labor, or certainly not work in the firm. In the initial years of a firm, family members are likely, or were likely, to accept a period of belt-tightening and to work for minimal compensation. But as firms become more established, expectations of remuneration changed and conflicts tend to emerge. Now, the timing and form of these conflicts vary depending on the size of the family firm, the amount of capital, the division of labor among family members, and the configuration of the family. Commonly, however, family relations became especially strained during the transition of ownership and management from one generation to the next, as disagreements emerged about which member of the next of the family should lead the firm, how many of the members of the next generation could be supported by the firm, and how managerial responsibility should be divided among them. Now, given Italian inheritance laws, which require equal division of the patrimony among siblings, most family firms were unable to survive beyond the second generation because they're just unable to expand sufficiently to incorporate children and then grandchildren into the firm. And this is, I think, an excellent example of how kinship, law, and custom directly shape what we might call the developmental cycle of family firms. Equal division of the family patrimony is a structural feature leading to the division of the firm's assets and, in most cases, to the firm itself. While some children and grandchildren may be incorporated into the firm and therefore strongly committed to its continuity, others who are not engaged in its management and certainly not supported by it may not. If the latter demand their equal share of the family patrimony, the resulting fragmentation of capital will lead to the division of the firm or its demise. Large family firms are sometimes able to put off dividing the firm's assets by transforming themselves into joint stock holding companies in which family members are the major shareholders. By paying dividends to family stockholders, those managing the firm may be able to satisfy other members of the family, at least for a while. Yet the likelihood of division before the firm can be handed on to the third generation is captured in a number of popular adages. I won't give you the Italian version, but the English version is, of course, from shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. This is a kind of common knowledge that I think people have in general about family firms and the problem of inheritance. So inheritance and succession are crucial, of course, to a firm's continuity, and so divisions or differences in inheritance law and expectations affect different outcomes. So if you consider the Napoleonic laws of equal inheritance among children in Italy and contrast that to U.S. inheritance law, where individuals are not required to transmit their property to any children, let alone to divide it equally among them. Of course, there are going to be huge differences in the ways in which family firms operate in these different environments. These differences in kinship structures and dynamics produce significant differences in accumulation, reinvestment, diversification, and division in the developmental cycle of family firms throughout the world. Now, because scholars and business consultants recognize that the transmission of the firm from one generation to the next is the most difficult phase in the cycle of the firm, they have paid considerable attention to it. Much less attention has been devoted to understanding what leads to the generation of new family firms. Indeed, there is a tendency among researchers to explain the persistence of family firms as a business form as a result of the success or failure of the intergenerational transmission of these firms. In other words, they conflate a low rate of intergenerational transmission with a low rate of persistence of the family firm as a social form. This leads them to interpret the low rate of intergenerational transmission of family firms in a particular setting as evidence that it is an unsustainable business form in that setting. The error in this conflation is obvious when we consider the parallel of equating the low rate of survival of particular families over successive generations with the low rate of survival of the family in general, or equating the survival over time of particular firms with the survival of firms in general. We know that new businesses are constantly being produced, even given the high rate of failure of business, and likewise, new families are constantly being formed, including by individuals who consider their family of origins to have been dysfunctional disasters. Family firms are no different. New ones may be continually created regardless of whether old ones are successful in surviving no longer than one generation. So in Como, new family firms frequently rose out of the ashes of previous ones. Family firms that dissolved as a result of disagreements among siblings, for example, commonly spawned new family firms as those siblings or other fractions of the family hived off to initiate their own firms. In short, the demise of a particular family firm did not mean the demise of the kinship enterprise. Now, kinship sentiments and commitments produced another crucial dynamic of Italian industrial districts. Whether they survived beyond the first, second, or third generation, family firms were the breeding grounds for managers and technicians who commonly left to start up their own firms. Now, this was a crucial dynamic of these industrial districts. Many of the owners of the subcontracting firms that I studied began their careers working as technical directors or managers in other firms in the period between before the owner's children were old enough to take on managerial jobs. Now, these employed managers, their non-family members, were well aware that they were going to eventually hit what I've called the kinship glass ceiling. In other words, the ceiling beyond which only family members are promoted. And so these employed managers often took on their jobs with the clear intention of acquiring both the practical training and the clients that would enable them to open their own firms. So the cap on their advancement in the firm, combined with the desire of men to be their own boss, fueled the ambitions of managers to start their own firms. The transformation of employed managers into the owners of subcontracting firms, and which of course were then trying to become larger and primary firms, that transformation was a well-established pattern of upward mobility in industrial districts such as Como, and an integral part of the process of the reproduction of the network of firms. Indeed, the dynamism of Italy's industrial districts depended in good part on what was experienced by Como firm owners as forms of betrayal. And here I just want to add a note to the discussion about cooperation, and anthropologists often do talk a lot about cooperation, but I think that in a just as important form of social relation, of course, is conflict and betrayal, which in this case is actually a very productive and generative force in business. I'm sure a lot of people know about that, right? This account of the structure and dynamics of Italian family firms hopefully explains why I'm arguing that family firms are usefully conceptualized not as primarily profit-seeking enterprises, but as kinship enterprises. And by kinship enterprise, I mean that they are the projects of collectivities of people who construe themselves to be connected by enduring family bonds and whose relations are structured by beliefs, sentiments, and commitments attached to these bonds. In treating them as kinship enterprises, I'm suggesting that we move beyond the recognition that economic action is embedded in structures of social relations to the recognition that what is commonly narrowly construed as economic action is actually a nexus of social action in which kinship goals, sentiments, and commitments are at play, and I would include among those, of course, ideas about gender. This enables us to understand how decisions about the investment and reinvestment of capital expansion and diversification and management structure are made without setting up an opposition between economic and kinship goals. These generative kinship processes continued to operate in the 1990s and the first decade of the 21st century, as Italian family firms began to outsource production to China as well as to other countries, and eventually to forge joint ventures with Chinese firms. Throughout this period of dynamic change and decline in manufacturing in Italy, the kinship sentiments of these firms were their most enduring characteristic. Indeed, the primary motive for relocating production to China, for forging transnational joint ventures, and developing transnational distribution chains has been to enable the firm to survive and expand, thus providing the next generation with the means of family continuity. As these Italian firms expanded production in China in the first decade of the 2000s, China also became the fastest growing market for Italian luxury fashion, and as a result then you have this decision on the part of Italian firms to produce in China and forge joint ventures in China. Although I have to admit that the production part for the highest level of Italian luxury fashions has been constrained recently because the biggest market for the growing, expanding market for their luxury items is, of course, China and Russia. And they found out that the Chinese, who are willing to pay those high prices for those luxury fashions, are not willing to do so if they were made in those products were made in China. So they're now bringing it back, manufacturing it in Italy. Right? Now, one consequence of the expansion of Italian family firms into China has been the alteration in the relations between proprietary families and the managers they hire. The establishment of overseas manufacturing divisions, joint ventures, and distribution offices has created managerial positions that family members are unwilling or unable to fill, thus increasing the opportunities for non-family managers who can now rise to higher levels of managerial responsibility. They could be director of production in China, director of a joint venture with a Chinese partner, or director of the company's operations in Asia. At the same time that managerial positions in these overseas production and distribution units have increased, the Italian managers who take these jobs are blocked from what had been the main path of social mobility in Italian industrial districts that I discussed above, namely opening a firm of their own. The outsourcing of manufacturing to China has largely closed off this avenue of career advancement and class mobility for these managers. As large, vertically integrated firms sent subcontracting work overseas, the opportunities for opening small subcontracting firms in industrial districts like China have shrunk. Transnational managers are in a particularly weak position to embark on this path of class mobility because they have neither the family networks, in other words, family labor, on which to draw, nor the social networks in either their home districts or in China to provide them with the labor and social capital to open a new firm. Initiating a business in China without these resources requires a large amount of financial capital, much more than they have. So while they have these expatriate social networks that are useful in finding managerial jobs, it doesn't give them access to either the financial or the social capital that they need to start a new firm. The Chinese managers employed in these Italian firms, however, have both family labor and local networks to embark on this path of social mobility. They have much better prospects of moving from paid employment to starting up their own firms, and this has fueled entrepreneurial ambitions among many of them, and along with this, the generation of Chinese family firms. So I just want to make a couple of suggestions here as to how macroeconomists might draw on the anthropological insights into family firms to revise their calculations of productivity in national and transnational businesses. First, the hidden, unreported work of family members, especially wives and daughters, are, I think, not generally included in assessments of the productivity of firms. And I don't mean by this only the work that they do on the factory floor or in the office, but the intimate, affective work they do to bolster, support, and nurture relations among family members who work in the firm. They're the PR office, they're the management structure that makes sure that these relationships are still working well. There's also the care and the support that they provide for ill and retired family members, as well as the care that they're providing for the children who are going to become the workers and the managers and the owners in the next generation. Second, understanding the dynamism of industrial districts in which family firms prevail requires an understanding of the kinship sentiments and commitments that they shape in continuing these firms, and also in leading to the demise of these firms, as well as to the generation of new firms. So what I'm arguing is that those kinship sentiments have an impact beyond simply the members of the family firm. They also shape what the sentiments, desires, and goals are of employees. Third, the interregional dynamics between the Italian textile and clothing manufacturing districts and the Chinese districts, in which the former initially outsourced production, requires an understanding of the kinship structures and dynamics of both Italians and Chinese. Kinship is as central to these Chinese industrial manufacturing districts as they were to the Italian districts they have now eclipsed. Thank you.